The last time my daughter Rebecca remembered my birthday, my husband Clifford was still alive. I know because she called him first, the way she always did when she wanted to plan something, without my knowing. He told me that evening while washing the dishes, laughing softly, proud of her in that particular quiet way he had, the kind of pride that doesn't need an audience. That was 4 years ago. I thought about it on the evening of my 64th birthday, sitting at the kitchen table in our house on Lakeview Crescent with a slice of vanilla cake I had picked up from the Sobeys on Division Street. I had bought it at 3 in the afternoon, which felt like the saddest thing I'd done in months. The candles were already melted sideways by the time I got home. I didn't bother lighting them. It was a Wednesday. My daughter Rebecca Harker lived 40 minutes away in Belleville. She hadn't called. I waited until past 9 o'clock, telling myself she'd just gotten busy. She was a teacher. Marking season. Or her husband Bryce had something on. Or their daughter Caitlin had practice. There were always reasons, and I had become very good at finding them on her behalf. At 9:17, my phone finally rang. I reached for it too quickly, embarrassed by my own eagerness. It was a text from my dentist's office, reminding me of a cleaning appointment. I set the phone face down on the table and looked at the cake. Happy birthday to me. The next morning I woke up early, the way I always did since Clifford died. 3 years now. The house still felt like it was waiting for him. His reading chair in the front room still had the slight dent in the cushion where he used to sit. I'd never had it reupholstered. I couldn't explain why. I made a pot of coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the light come up over the backyard. The maple Clifford planted the year we bought the place had gone completely red overnight, the way it did every October. He loved that tree. Used to say it was the most reliable thing about autumn in Ontario. More reliable than the leaves, anyway. I smiled at that, then felt the sadness underneath the smile. He would have called me at midnight. He did every year without fail, even the one time he was in the hospital overnight getting his knee looked at. He called from the ward at 12:01, just to be first. Rebecca had not called at midnight. She had not called at all. As I stood there with my coffee going cold, I had to be honest with myself in a way I had been avoiding. This wasn't a first. The birthday before this one, she had sent a text at 11 in the morning. Happy birthday, Mum. Hope your day is lovely, with 2 balloon emojis, which felt like something generated automatically, not typed by a person who had thought about me. The birthday before that, nothing until supper time, and then a call that lasted 4 minutes and ended with her asking whether I'd thought any more about the house. The house. Our house. The one Clifford and I had bought in 1991 when we were both 30 and completely terrified by the mortgage. I went into the dining room and looked at the table. I had set it for 4 the night before, hoping. Rebecca, Bryce, Caitlin. I had made Clifford's mother's pot roast, the one that takes 3 hours and fills the whole house with the smell of a Sunday afternoon from 20 years ago. The food was still in the fridge. The table was still set. Somewhere between making the pot roast and waiting for them to arrive, I had stopped lying to myself. They were not coming. They had never said they were coming. I had assumed, wanted, and then spent an evening pretending the assumption had been real. I cleared the table myself. About an hour later, my phone rang. This time, it was my granddaughter, Caitlin Harker. She was 17 and already more thoughtful than most adults I knew. She sounded nervous when I answered, which told me she already knew about the birthday. Grandma, I'm so sorry, she said. I wanted to call you last night. But you didn't. A pause. Mum said you were tired and needed a quiet evening. I stood very still in the kitchen. Rebecca had told her I needed a quiet evening, not forgotten, managed. The difference was worse. Are you okay? Caitlin asked. I'm fine, sweetheart, I said. Tell me about school. She did, and we talked for 20 minutes, and by the end of it something had settled into place. Not comfort exactly. Clarity. The only person who had been thinking about me on my birthday was the 17-year-old who hadn't been allowed to call. That afternoon, Rebecca finally phoned. Her voice was perfectly normal, cheerful, even, the way it always was when she wasn't thinking about anything difficult. Hey, Mum, how was your day? How was your day? as if it had been any other Wednesday. "Quiet," I said. "Good. Good. Listen." Bryce and I were talking, and there it was, the pivot I had been waiting for, arriving after approximately 8 seconds of conversation. "And we think it might be worth getting someone in to assess the house, just to see what it could go for in the current market." The house. I looked around my kitchen. The corkboard where Caitlin's school photographs were pinned up beside a grocery list from 3 weeks ago. The slightly crooked cabinet door Clifford had promised to fix and never got around to. The window over the sink where the light came in, just right in the late afternoon, gold and slow. "I'm not selling the house," I said. No, not right now, obviously. Just eventually, Mum, for planning purposes." Planning purposes. I had heard that phrase 3 times in the last 6 months. It sounded responsible. It sounded caring. It felt like something else entirely. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The strange thing about grief, not just the grief of losing a spouse, but the quieter kind, the grief of slowly realizing a relationship has become something different than you thought, is that it doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in. You find it in small moments. A birthday call that's actually about real estate. A table set for 4 that nobody came to. A granddaughter told not to phone because grandma needs her quiet evening. I had been noticing it for 2 years. I had been ignoring it for about the same amount of time. The following Saturday, Rebecca and Bryce came for lunch. Rebecca's idea, which surprised me. She never suggested visits. Bryce suggested them even less. He was a pleasant enough man in the way a realtor at an open house is pleasant. Surface warmth, very attentive to the numbers. He brought a bottle of wine, which was new. For the first 30 minutes, everything felt like a normal family lunch. We talked about Caitlin's school play, about a restaurant in Belleville they'd been to, about whether we'd get an early snow this year. I poured the wine. I served the soup I'd made. Then Bryce said, very casually, as though it had just occurred to him, "Have you thought about whether this plate might be too much to manage on your own?" I looked at him across the table. The tea? He was cutting his bread with the relaxed certainty of a man who believed the conversation had been settled somewhere before it started. "It's not too much," I said. "Of course not right now," Rebecca said quickly, in the tone she used when she was smoothing something over. "But Bryce just means, in terms of planning purposes," I said. "Exactly," she smiled, relieved. I smiled back and said nothing more. But I was listening differently now. Not to what they were saying, to what the silences between the words contained. By the time they left, I understood something I had been resisting for a long time. Rebecca wasn't visiting to see me. She was checking on an asset. 3 days later, I went into Clifford's study for the first time since I'd boxed up his papers. I had left the room more or less the way it was, which I told myself was practical. Good desk, good light. The real reason was that it still smelled like him in there. Old books and the cedar of the pencil holder his father had made him. And, underneath it all, just the faintest trace of the coffee he used to carry in there every morning. I opened the bottom drawer to look for an old insurance document. Under a folder of receipts, there was a small tin box. I frowned. I had never seen it before. The lid lifted easily. Inside were 2 envelopes. The first held some financial documents I didn't immediately recognize. The second envelope had my name on it, in Clifford's handwriting, which I still knew better than my own. Muriel. My hands weren't steady when I opened it. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten front and back, dated about 8 months before he died. He must have known before he told me, which was such a Clifford thing to do. Plan first, worry later. My darling Muriel, he had written. If you're reading this, it means the last argument we had was probably about whether to get the gutters cleaned. And I was right, and you still won't admit it. I laughed even though my eyes were already blurring. Then I kept reading. He wrote about everything. About the 32 years we'd spent in that house. About the summer we drove to Cape Breton. Because I had always wanted to see the Cabot Trail, and we ended up taking 5 wrong turns and arriving at sunset, with the whole thing glowing orange and purple ahead of us, and neither of us speaking for a full 5 minutes because there wasn't anything to say. Then I've been worried about one thing, not the house, Not the money you. He wrote that years before he got sick. When the business sold, he had kept a separate investment account. Not to hide anything from me, I had access to everything he owned, but to keep it outside the general estate picture, specifically because he wanted me to have something that belonged entirely to me, separate from the inheritance calculations of anyone who might be doing them. I read that line 3 times. He had seen it coming. Of course he had. He had always been better at reading people than I was. The account, he wrote, was managed through a financial advisor named Murray Bellingham, whose number was clipped to the back page. It had been growing quietly for 7 years. Contact Murray when you're ready, he wrote. The money is for living, not for leaving. Please remember the difference. I sat in that study for a long time after I finished the letter. Then I cried. Not because I was sad, though I was, but because it was so entirely like him to love me that precisely and that quietly and that practically, all at once. I called Murray Bellingham the next morning. He answered on the second ring, and when I told him who I was, I heard him exhale slowly. Mrs. Dawson's, he said. I've been hoping you'd call. We met at his office in Kingston the following Thursday. The account was real, and it was considerably more than I had expected. Not generational wealth, but life-changing on a different scale. Enough to travel. Enough to pursue the things I had been setting aside for 30 years. Enough to stop making decisions based on other people's futures rather than my own present. The most important thing Murray told me, as I sat in his office with my coat still on, because I had forgotten to take it off. Rebecca knew nothing about this account. It had never appeared in any family financial conversation. As far as my daughter understood, my assets consisted of the house, a modest RRSP, and a small savings account. As I drove home, I thought about that for a very long time. The week after I met with Murray, I did 3 things. The first thing I did was book a trip. Clifford and I had talked for 20 years about going to Portugal. Lisbon, the Alentejo, the long light over the Tagus in the evenings. We had a folder in the filing cabinet with torn-out magazine pages about it. We'd get there eventually. Eventually, that word we kept using as if time were a renewable resource. I booked the trip with my hands shaking and something lifting in my chest that I hadn't felt in longer than I could name. The second thing I did was buy myself a proper winter coat. Not practical navy, not sensible charcoal. I had been looking at a bottle green wool coat in a shop window on Princess Street for 3 months, crossing to the other side of the street each time because I couldn't justify the expense. I went in and bought it that afternoon. The third thing I did was sign up for a watercolor class that met Tuesday evenings at the public library. I had loved to paint when I was young. I had stopped when Rebecca was born and never started again. The way you stop 100 things and tell yourself you'll return to them when life slows down, and life never does. I told Caitlin about the trip on a Sunday phone call. She actually screamed. Portugal? Grandma, that's amazing! Clifford always wanted to go, I said. Her voice softened. He'd be so happy. 2 weeks later, Rebecca called. Mum, I noticed some unusual activity on your account. She said it carefully. The way you approach something you already know will go badly. I booked a trip, I said. A trip. To Portugal. A long silence. That's Mum, that's quite expensive. I stood at my kitchen window. The maple in the backyard was nearly bare now. Just a few last leaves. I know, I said. I'm very excited about it. Are you sure this is a wise time for something like that? I thought about Clifford's letter. About the folder of magazine pages. About 30 years of eventually. Yes, I said. I think it's exactly the right time. She seemed unsettled by the steadiness in my voice. We ended the call shortly after. The green coat hung on the back of my bedroom door, and I looked at it every morning before I got dressed. About a month. After the Portugal booking, I ran into Caitlin at the Tim Hortons on Division Street. She had driven over from Belleville on her own, which she was allowed to do now that she had her license. She hugged me for a long time in the parking lot, and I noticed she looked like she'd been carrying something heavy. After about 10 minutes of talking about everything else, she said, Grandma, there's something I need to show you. She unlocked and distracted them. She unlocked her phone with both hands, the way you do when you're nervous about what you're about to hand over. I wasn't supposed to see these, she said. They were on the shared iPad. The messages were between Rebecca and Bryce. I read them slowly. She's spending more than we budgeted for, one message said. Bryce had written it. Budgeted. They had created a budget. For my money, for my estate, for my future. Another message from Rebecca. If she keeps this up, there won't be much left by the time we need it. Then from Bryce. Once she moves out of that house, it solves most of it. We just need her to see it's the sensible choice. Once she moves out. Not if. Once. As though ownership had already changed. As though my future was simply a business transaction on a timeline someone else had set. I looked up from the phone. Caitlin's eyes were red. I'm sorry, she whispered. You have nothing to be sorry for, I said. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. I've known for a while. I kept hoping it wasn't what it looked like. I reached across the table and held her hand. She was 17. And she had been carrying this alone, caught between loving her parents and knowing what they were doing wasn't right. When I got home that evening, I sat in Clifford's chair, really sat in it, for the first time since he died, and I read his letter again. If someone values what you own more than who you are, he had written, the only answer is to start valuing yourself more than they do. I had thought, when I first read that line, that it was abstract advice. Now it felt like specific instructions. I called a lawyer the following Monday. Her name was Renee Moreau, and she had handled a property dispute for my friend Olive Tremblay the previous spring. Olive had described her as the kind of person who doesn't flinch. That was exactly what I needed. Renee listened to everything. When I finished, she asked me 3 questions, quiet and precise. And then she said, the good news is that your assets are entirely your own. The concerning news is that someone has been behaving as though they're not. 2 hours later, I left her office with a plan. The Portugal trip was in early February. I spent the weeks before it in a state I hadn't experienced in years. Real anticipation, the kind that makes you sleep better and wake up looking forward to the morning. Rebecca called twice in that period, both times circling back to the house, to expenses, to whether I had thought about long-term planning. Both times, I gave her the same steady answer. I was fine, I was happy, and I would let her know if anything changed. Both times she hung up sounding like she didn't know what to do with me, which I found, quietly, a little satisfying. Caitlin came and helped me pack. She was giddy about Portugal in a way that made me feel 20 years younger. On the morning I left, she stood on my front steps in the cold and waved until the taxi turned the corner. Portugal was everything the folder of magazine pages had promised, and several things it hadn't. The light was the first thing. The way it sat differently there, heavier and older, as if it had been accumulating warmth for centuries. I spent 3 days in Lisbon walking streets that tilted up and away from the river, photographing the tiled facades with a small camera I had bought in December, slightly embarrassed at the counter. The way you are when you're doing something for yourself that you've been postponing for too long. I thought about Clifford constantly. Not sadly. Exactly. More like a continuous background conversation. The way you think about someone you know would have loved what you're seeing. He would have been unbearable about the food. He would have wanted to learn 10 words of Portuguese and use them entirely wrong. He would have sat across from me at a small table above the Tagus with a glass of red wine and been completely, unreservedly content. On the 4th day, I sat at exactly that kind of table, above exactly that view, and ordered for 2 without thinking, and then sat with 2 glasses of wine and drank them both, slowly, watching the sun go into the river. I wasn't sad. I was profoundly, quietly glad to be there. My phone rang twice that week, Rebecca, both times. I answered once from a cafe in the Alentejo. Mom, where are you? I've been trying to reach you. Portugal, I said. I'm in a town called Évora. There's a Roman temple in the main square. It's extraordinary. And everything's, are you being careful with? I'm having a wonderful time, I said. I'll call you when I'm home. I hung up, ordered a second coffee, and went back to watching the temple. When I returned to Kingston in mid-February, a certified letter was waiting in my mailbox. From a law firm in Belleville, The letter suggested, in careful professional language, that recent significant changes in spending patterns among older adults sometimes warranted a review of their financial decision-making capacity. I called Renee Moreau the same afternoon. She read the letter. Then she said, "Good. Good. It means you've changed the picture they had." 3 days later, Rebecca came to the house without calling first. I heard her car in the driveway and watched her walk up the front path with her arms crossed, even though it wasn't that cold. I made tea. I waited. "I'm worried about you, Mum," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. She had the expression she used to wear as a teenager when she was about to tell me something she knew I wouldn't like. "I know you think you are," I said. She blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means I think there's a difference between worrying about me and worrying about what might happen to the things I own." I kept my voice even. "And I think, lately, you've been doing more of the second." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's not fair," she said. "When did you last ask me whether I was happy?" I asked. Not unkindly, genuinely curious. She opened her mouth, closed it. "When did you last visit without Bryce mentioning the house, or the market, or my long-term plans?" She looked down at the table. "I forgot your birthday," I said. 3 years in a row, Rebecca, not a card that arrived late. Forgotten. And the 1 year Caitlin tried to call, you told her I needed a quiet evening." She looked up at that. "I was trying to." "I know what you were trying to do," I said. "You were managing the situation. I wasn't a person you were thinking about. I was a situation to be managed." The word landed between us. Rebecca's eyes filled, and I felt my own throat tighten, because she was still my daughter. She had always been my daughter. I remembered the exact weight of her when she was first put into my arms, and that doesn't go away. "I found a letter from your father," I said. "In his study." She looked up. "He wrote it before he told me he was sick. He left a letter for you, too. You can have it when you're ready. But I think it might be easier to read after some time has passed." She pressed her lips together and nodded, very small, and for a moment she looked 17 again. "I'm not sick," I told her. "I'm not reckless. I am 64 years old, and I spent 30 years putting everyone else first. And I am trying now to do things I've been meaning to do since before you were born. That is not a crisis. That is, I think, what your father would have called the whole point." She cried then. Real tears, not the managed kind. I handed her the box of tissues from the counter and let her. When she finally stopped, she said very quietly, "I didn't realize how much I'd been treating you like something to organize." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry, Mum." Real apologies sound different from concern dressed as control. I had heard enough of both in the past year to know the difference. "I know you are," I said. We sat there for a long time after that, talking. Not about money. Not about the house. About Clifford. About the summer when Rebecca was 14 and the three of us drove to the Cabot Trail and took every wrong turn and arrived at sunset with the sky glowing ahead of us and nobody speaking. About Caitlin. About the things you set down and forget to pick back up. By the time she left, just before supper, something had shifted. Not fixed, not repaired the way things get repaired when the damage was simple, but shifted. The way a window shifts when it finally gets unstuck. 6 months later, on a Tuesday evening in October, I stood at the front of the meeting room at the public library. The same room where my watercolor class met every week, and announced the Clifford Dawson Community Fund. The fund would support seniors experiencing isolation and provide emergency financial assistance to families in crisis. Renee Moreau had helped me set it up. Olive Tremblay was in the front row and cried through the entire announcement. Caitlin was there too. She found me afterward and held on for a long time. "Grandpa would have loved this," she said. "I know," I said. That was the point. Rebecca came. She arrived a few minutes after the announcement, slipping into a seat near the back. We saw each other across the room and exchanged a small nod. After the event, when most people had left, she came to me and handed me a folded piece of paper, a drawing Caitlin had made. The three of us at the kitchen table, the old maple just visible through the window behind us. "She made it for you," Rebecca said. "I've been working up to bringing it." I looked at the drawing for a long time. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my coat pocket. The green one. "Come for dinner next week," I said. "Just the three of you. I'll make the pot roast." She nodded. Her eyes were bright. "And Rebecca?" She looked at me. "Set a reminder for October 9th. She understood immediately. She pressed her lips together and said, "I already did." 3 days before my 65th birthday, I went out to the backyard in the early morning with my coffee and stood under the maple. All the red was back. Same as last year. Same as every October since 1991. I thought about Clifford, the way I always did. About Portugal. About the watercolor class, where I had just finished a rendering of the Roman temple at Evora that my instructor called surprisingly confident. About the community fund, and the first application we had received, an 81-year-old woman from the east end of the city whose family had moved away, who had written that sometimes she went 3 days without speaking a word to another person. I thought about the tin box in the bottom drawer, about 4 pages of handwriting, about the line that had changed everything. "The money is for living, not for leaving. Please remember the difference." I had remembered. I was still remembering. On the morning of my birthday, the phone rang at midnight exactly. I was still awake, half expecting it, without quite admitting it to myself. It was Rebecca. "Happy birthday, Mum," she said. I set 4 reminders. I wasn't taking any chances. I laughed, which surprised me. Then I cried a little, which didn't. We talked for almost an hour, about nothing important, about everything, the way we used to, before all of it, before the silences and the managed situations and the certified letters and the long months of finding my way back to myself. I don't know what the next years look like. I don't know how much has changed and how much is still being rebuilt. What I know is that I am 65 years old, and I am alive, and there is a green wool coat on the back of my bedroom door, and a watercolor class on Tuesday evenings, and a folder on my desk with information about the Azores for next spring. I know that a marriage of 32 years can leave something behind that takes years to discover, something patient and precise, waiting in a tin box in the bottom drawer, timed perfectly for when you need it most. And I know that when you spend enough years disappearing into other people's needs, the first real act of love you can manage, the truest, most difficult one, is the act you finally turn toward yourself. I blew out the candles on my 65th birthday cake. This time, I had set them myself, and every single one of them was lit.